It's now my immense pleasure to welcome our first three guests here on stage. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Uzodinma Iweala, to Rachel Rose, and to Ian Cheng. Uzodimna Iweala is the CEO of the Africa Center in New York, also a medical doctor and author of several books and novels. You all met Rachel Rose yesterday. We should give a big round of applause for her amazing installation you all experienced last night. Rachel Rose. And of course, we welcome here Ian Cheng, who just returned from the Venice Biennale, where he's presenting the most recent incarnation of Bob, an AI creature, an ever-evolutive AI creature, which started at the Serpentine Galleries in London. We're going to hear more about that from Ian. It has a lot to do with the theme of cooperation, of course, also between man and machine. I wanted to begin with Uzo and actually ask Uzo to tell us a little bit to talk about interdependence, about cooperation, about the theme of today. And, whilst collaborative structures have existed throughout time, the early 21st century, brings a growing urge for interdependence and the establishment, of course, for more concrete action. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about, your practice and how to deal with governance responsibly and how to bring this idea of cooperation and interdependence into our daily lives, how to further that skill, as Richard Sennett says.
Wow, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Hans. That's a small question to start with. I think, to start with, for me, I think the place I'd like to start is something that I've been thinking about recently when it comes to a debate that I think we're all seeing now, which, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe here, or on the continent of Africa, where I'm from, Nigeria, it's this idea of the growing creep of authoritarianism and nationalism versus sort of everybody's, I guess, God of the day, democracy. If you want, people put those on opposites of each other. And for me, it then becomes a question where one says that democracy is the act of cooperation versus authoritarianism, which is this idea of sort of the single, the one. And I don't actually think that that is the debate, if we're talking about togetherness, that we should be having. And I think it's a more essential question than that, and it becomes a question about essentially what I would say is the politics of vanity versus the politics of vulnerability. Vanity, obviously, being, we know, this idea of, the essential idea of I alone can do, and vulnerability being the admission, and I think one of the major themes of what we're talking about today, that I need you, right? That I cannot do it alone. That I have to be aware of my weaknesses as an individual. We have to be aware of our weaknesses as a species. We have to be aware of the fact that we can't function without anyone else. And I think whether you're talking about that sort of on a biological or ecological level, or you're talking about that in a political context, I think that becomes the basis for any kind of discussion, any kind of debate that we're having. And I think it's something that in the work and the writing that I do that's central, whether you're talking about characters in fiction or, say, something like the Africa Center, which is really about how do we reframe the understanding of what the continent is and its essentiality to the rest of the world. The idea that you can't function, I think the world in general has tried to function as if Africa is a separate thing and doesn't exist in a lot of ways. It's not part of the conversations that we think we're having. But in actuality, it is central. It is the conversation that we're having. And it's sort of within that context that a lot of the work that I put together comes through. But I'll stop there.
And of course, as part of your work, there is not only the Africa Center you mentioned, and then your work actually with nonfiction, but you also are a novelist. And we spoke this morning at breakfast with Ian and Rachel about your novels. In 2005, you published your first novel, Beasts of No Nation, and that was an expansion of your your thesis, and it seems very relevant for what we're discussing here today. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the genesis of that amazing, amazing novel, which for those of you who haven't read it, it's an urgent book.
Sure, thank you, Hans. So Beasts of No Nation is actually it's a novel about a child soldier in an unnamed West African country. So it's a young boy, maybe aged 9 to 12, who's essentially abducted from his family after his village is raided and forced to fight for a sort of nondescript group of rebels. And really the idea behind that, I mean, it does touch on some of the themes we're talking about. This like, where do you find your family, right? And how do you find a cause that you can adhere to? And that can be both a very positive thing in terms of providing structure and safety, but it can also be a negative thing if that family itself doesn't maybe reflect a set of values that increases the people or the number of people within that family. That's just broad-based. But really it's about the journey from a position of safety into this ultimate vulnerability told through the eyes of a child, and essentially what that does to the human core, and whether or not we can come back from some of the things that we face when we have to take that journey.
And then, of course, your second book is a non-fiction book, and it's a book about AIDS and has a lot to do with this idea actually of listening, because you did a lot of conversations. It's not a declaration, it has to do with listening. Can you tell us about that aspect of your work?
Sure. So at a certain point in time when I had started medical school, I got really frustrated with the way that we in medicine sort of interacted with patients. One, and then two, with the way that people spoke about disease. Specifically HIV/AIDS, which is a disease that has been very prevalent on the continent of Africa. And I think a lot of the understandings of HIV were very wrapped up in old understandings of Africans as fundamentally other. People that you couldn't, if they were even people. And some of the readings that you can do around Africans as people or quasi-people are really interesting, fascinating, and disgusting. But you know, when you put the two things together, you've got this really interesting narrative about the continent's disease and what it means for the rest of the world. And so what I wanted to do with that book was really try to understand how people in a country like Nigeria, which in some ways could represent some of the other countries that are dealing with the HIV epidemic in Africa, really interacted with the disease. And to do that, as you said, it required a little bit more than just going out and doing like book research or scientific research. It required really sitting down and listening to people and trying to understand not just the narratives that they were telling about this disease, but also how those narratives were told and how the kind of narratives vary depending on socioeconomic status, geographical region, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was about 4 years worth of interviewing people across all of Nigeria, which for me was very special because it not only gave me a sense of how people interact with disease and how people do express this idea of vulnerability, but also gave a chance to really learn what it means to build a country that is made of so many different kinds of people. As you know, Nigeria, 200 million people, 300 different languages, in an area that's probably about 3 times the size of California. So to be able to travel around that and see what it essentially means to live in a world as such, I think was pretty spectacular.
And then I found another text of yours which I thought would be particularly interesting for the theme of these LUMA Days, actually, and that's a text from 2013, Who We Exclude When We Say We, and it's a text which discusses the issue of inclusion and exclusion when thinking of a sort of general first-person plural. So I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because it seems interesting, the issue of generalization, non-generalization, togetherness, us, them.
Yeah, I think this is something that Ian, I think you and I were talking about just from a sort of narrative perspective, and this idea of sort of the I involved in story versus the we involved in story, and how you decide essentially, for me it's a question of what perspective do you write from and what gives you the best view on the world. And I mean, it depends entirely on the story that you're telling, but I sometimes think that, and I'm trying to figure out how to say this, like within, again, it goes back to this vanity thing. Within the societies that we've constructed, obviously the I has taken precedence over the idea of we. And on top of that all, when we do speak about we, it's a very limited set of people often. And it requires a certain amount of imagination to expand the idea of we, who we let in to the groups that we consider dear. And who we let in then, of course, informs everything from our politics to our economic structures and whatnot. But I think from a narrative perspective, it's something that, you know, it's a problem, right? And I find that very interesting and fascinating. I don't know like what you think, but I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, it's actually telepathic, because I was just about to ask Ian, because it's the perfect transition, so thank you for that. And maybe Ian, if you can connect to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, we were just speaking a little bit earlier before the talks about, well, I was kind of asking him about how to structure a screenplay, because I'm trying to write one myself at the moment. And I had come across this very interesting theory of narrative from the 90s that came out of USC called Dramatica. And it's this idea that a story is essentially a model of a human mind trying to solve a problem. Of course, we always get stuck trying to solve a problem. And so the best way to get unstuck to solve a problem is to take different perspectives and try to hold them simultaneously. And at its best, I think a very complete narrative or a very complete story can weave different perspectives simultaneously, and more specifically in Dramatica, which is very interesting to me, is that there's the idea that there's an overarching story that is a narrative of the they, like how everyone, all the characters within the novel or the screenplay face a problem. And then there's the first person or main character perspective, which is the I, which is almost like if you imagine a soldier on the field, how different that is from the they, which is more like a general looking over the entire landscape. And then there's the you, which is, they call it the influence character, who stands in the way of the main character and offers an alternate perspective. And then finally there's the us, or the relationship story, which, to give a very concrete example, like in Star Wars, it's like the battle between the rebels and the Empire. And then you have Luke Skywalker's point of view as this little podunk farm kid who has big dreams about, he doesn't know which way to go, what to do, but he knows he wants more than a farm life. And then he encounters Obi-Wan Kenobi, who is objectively a character within the larger story, but for him, for Luke Skywalker, is a direct kind of mentor relationship. And what's interesting, I think what you said about the us perspective is that it's inherently limited. I think it's cognitively limited for human beings to think of us as more than, I mean, even a single relationship. You can't actually think of us as all of us. It's just almost cognitively impossible. And so I think what's so beautiful about this model of story is that it weaves us, which is purely a dynamic between two characters, into this larger they perspective, which is the story that everyone faces as a central problem. And I think narrative at its best kind of ties all this together. And you feel that when you watch a movie that feels complete. You feel that it's both emotional and makes a larger argument.
And that, of course, brings us also to the question then of actually different sub-personalities composing a person. So the person is a form of togetherness. And it brings us to Bob. And as I mentioned, Bob started at the Serpentine. It was an amazing experience, because all of a sudden an AI artwork inhabited the gallery for several weeks, and it created a completely different experience for visitors, because in a way, you know, if you look at the visitor book, some visitors say they came all the way to listen or to see Bob, and Bob ignored them, and others said they came back every day because Bob was so nice to them. And since then, Bob has evolved. Now, you spoke in relation to the Venice version of Bob, which is a more evolved version. Post-Serpentine, it continues to grow. You talk about a congress of demons, so the demons are there. And you talk about the idea that there are several sub-personalities composing a person. Can you tell us about that and what's happening to Bob in Venice as we speak? And maybe also how everybody can actually download the app and to become part of Bob and build a Bob shrine.
So Bob is a project I've been working on for the last 2 years, and prior to that I was making these simulations of much larger virtual ecosystems with little characters inside. And then when it came to making a new project, I thought maybe it'd be, for me, much more interesting to take the idea of a creature as its own compositional space, and that within one individual agent or creature, it is already its own like explosive ecosystem inside. And I came to this idea that by using a creature as a compositional space, I could deal with the growth of its body from birth to death, and in growing its body, of course, its mind has to grow, and of course, its mind affects the growth of its body and how it survives. And initially, I was trying to work on a very totalizing model of how Bob's AI would work, and I kept coming up against a ceiling. I could never get as complex as I wanted it to be, and I realized that the better way to go would be to compose Bob's brain as a composition of sub-personalities, almost like little demons. And I ended up calling this the Congress of Demons. And I started to think of each demon as its own sub-personality that's obsessed with one little story. So for example, there's an eater demon obsessed with finding food and eating it. And what that allows for is and I think this is true to our life, is that when we're obsessed with one goal or story that we want to enact, every object in the environment doesn't have to be machine learned and understood sensorially. Instead, Bob sees every object as either a tool or obstacle or totally irrelevant. And so in wanting something, Bob's perception immediately constrains itself to something much simpler. And I don't think we're so different. And the demons basically compete with each other to take control of Bob's body and enact their little mini story. And Bob's whole architecture cognitively is, to best sum it up, is to try to minimize surprise for itself. So if it encounters a new object, like a new kind of glass shape that's never encountered before, but it has encountered a coffee cup, it will resist the emotion to feel surprised by the new glass by comparing it to the coffee cup that it knows and make a first impression, even if it's a really biased, incorrect impression of the glass. Maybe it's a very sharp glass, but it kind of looks like cylindrical, like the shape of the coffee cup. So Bob will try to drink from it, and when Bob drinks from it and gets cut in the mouth, this will create an intense emotional surprise. And I think it is in the emotional surprise, we programmed this, but I think it's true of life, in the intense emotional surprise of that mismatch of expectation that Bob then updates its model, updates a set of rules, and creates a new rule for what this new kind of glass cylindrical shape means. So it's only in, I think, almost a mini trauma or a mini surprise or surprise and expectation that I think Bob actually learns something new. And I don't think that's so different from how we work on a much more complex level.
And can you tell us, because I think it would be nice for everyone here present, for all of us, to build Bob shrines. How can we download the app? Can you tell everybody so you can all, on your phone, download the app?
It's Bob's, BOBS.ai. And so the way Bob...
In one word, B-O-B-S.
Like Bob's plural.
B-O-B-S-A.ai. B-O-B-S-A-I.
Bob's AI, that app is the primary way in which you as a viewer can influence Bob almost as a kind of parental figure by making it offerings. And those offerings will go directly to the Bob that is currently living in Venice right now.
To be with Bob is all we ask. I had a last question, which will then also actually be the transition to Rachel. I wanted to ask you, Ian, about the kind of cooperation and interdependence of man and machine, because I was the day before yesterday at the Google Zeitgeist conference. Google does this annual conference outside London, bringing together technology with all different disciplines. And Demis Hassabis did a very remarkable speech about AI and deep mind, and John Hennessy talked about basically the same thing, talked about the Go experiment and talked about AI, and it became, of course, apparent that it's still the infancy of AI. There is going to be such a massive development over the next couple of years, and of course, a lot of discussions are about the negative impact this might have, that work might disappear. Of course, new work will be created, but a lot of jobs might be lost, so there's a danger of that. And then, of course, also a lot of scenarios where actually the machines might take over. Now, you've been more optimistic, and you've often said that you also see a possibility for AI being a kind of an extension, maybe, of the human being, and you've said that it's also a possible integration, that we can somehow integrate AI into human culture. And I think it's interesting with the topic of this year's LUMA Days, to discuss this idea of cooperation and interdependence in relation to AI. I wanted to hear you speak about that, if possible.
Yeah, well, AI is definitely I think it's in its infancy right now, but it's accelerating very quickly. And I think maybe the first thing to say is that there's going to be a really painful, long transition where people have to search for new kinds of meaning in their life, especially when work gets taken away, and when things that would otherwise occupy you as a structure for your life are just much more easily done, much more economically cheap to use AI to do. But I think in the longer term, I mean, maybe the beauty of AI is the moment when it becomes integrated with your own mind and an augmentation of yourself. So there's this idea that, you know, when you're hungry, you say, I'm hungry, but you never say, my limbic system is hungry. But really, it is the subcortical part of your brain that is the part that is hungry. Instead, you say, I am hungry. You become one with this almost reptilian part of yourself that has its own mind, has its own demon. And I think perhaps maybe 100 years from now or 50 years from now, when AI is more integrated into our own minds, we might think of AI as an extension or an ego state that is within us, and we would not be able to distinguish between the AI that is a part of us, the subcortical reptile that is a part of us, and the prefrontal cortex that likes stories and likes planning that is part of us. And I think this will be a very strange but beautiful moment and sort of redemptive for AI.
And of course, it brings us to the fact that, you know, we live a moment of transition. Massive transformation is happening at this very moment through technology. Society is changing. And that brings us, Rachel, to your amazing piece, which premiered last night. It was a world premiere in Arles, a work which you've been working on for many, many months, together with Tom Eccles, the curator, who curated the project. It will then, after Arles, be shown at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City. And it's, of course, as well about a moment of transition. It's about a moment where society changed. And I could not help thinking last night, you know, what does it have to do with our moment? Because, of course, it's again a moment where there is a lot of fear involved. And yet at the same time, you know, when Richard Sennett talks about this late moment of capitalism we're experiencing now, when he talks about the homogenized cities in which it happens, when he talks about the fact that there is no more time for the skills of cooperation in that capitalism, it's actually in the epoch of your film that all of that began. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the film, about enclosure, and about how you got interested in that specific period in time.
So in previous works and in general how I work as an artist is I take a feeling or sense that I have in the present, either just something everyday in my life or something external to me, like I made a work after Hurricane Sandy in New York, and I try to trace that feeling into deeper moments in history and see how that moment might express something about the present. So obviously we're all experiencing such catastrophe on a scale that's unimaginable now, environmentally, socially. We're lost in an ether, coming closer and closer to our extinction as humans and the end of the world as we currently know it. So what more urgent thing for me as an artist to think about than maybe beginnings of this? This led me to 17th century agrarian England, but really this moment in 17th century all over the world, the shift between feudalism into capitalism, the early seeds of the agricultural revolution that led to the industrial revolution, that led to modernity, that led to the structures of how we live today, the buildings, the money, the systems, the way that we travel, took shape in this moment. And all over the world, I chose this one place because I was interested in the loss of common space and what that meant for people's psyches and their relationship to themselves and to animals. And so that's how I ended up in 17th century agrarian England.
And can you tell us a little bit about the process? Because it's a very unusual process for you, because it's basically, I mean, as always, it's a display feature. We are actually climbing. For those of you who haven't yet made the experience, it's important you visit it later today. One literally climbs, I mean, it's actually more a mountain than a hill, and sees the film from there. And the film is actually neither 2D nor 3D. It reminded me of something Leon Golub once said when he says, often things are 2.5D. And I think it's a classic example of a 2.5D artwork, because it's sometimes 2D, sometimes 3D, and you never really know, and it's in between. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And also, of course, unusually for you, you worked with actors, because you usually don't do that.
So one of the things Ian and I talk a lot about is story, and story as a container for meaning. And without having the structure of a story, as an artist, as a writer, it's hard to parse out something of meaning. And oftentimes when you see an artwork, even like a painting or something that has an instantaneous effect, you might perceive, oh, it doesn't have a story, but in fact there's a whole backstory that surrounds that instantaneous experience that allows you to access it. And in each of my works, I've been delving deeper and deeper into story and making more full-bodied, I guess, stories that can contain more. So writing a script with a screenwriter and casting and working with actors was the most effective way to evolve story, to hold these questions. In terms of the installation, one of the things we spoke about yesterday is that when you show something that is so filmic and seems so much like, well, why wouldn't this exist in a movie theater? In the context of something like LUMA Arles or the Park Avenue Armory, there really has to be a reason for it to live here and not be in a black theater. And for me, that has to do with our bodies, which is our scale in relationship to the scale of the building we're in, the projection light, this artificial apparatus, and what that means in relationship to natural light, how we're hearing sound and where it's coming from, how many people are viewing a work. Is it one person? Is it 20 people? Is it 200 people? All these things affect how you absorb story and how you absorb meaning. So here, when I was given the opportunity to show it at the Grand Hall, I thought about this and took this orb that's in the film that has a kind of strength on Recent, the main character's psyche as the film evolves, and put it in the space so that maybe it would also have a strength on you, and it operates maybe between a void and a place to sit, and also in a very technical, necessary way, a viewpoint from which to access this oscillation between 2D and 3D that the holographic screen creates.
Can you talk a little bit about editing? I mean, we spoke about it a bit last night in the conversation with Tom Eccles, but it's interesting in the same conference where, you know, we discussed AI and art, and it was happened at the Google Cultural Institute in Paris. And as we spoke with Ian about it, I think it would be interesting to talk with you as well about AI. You said that actually there can be partnerships with AI, there can be cooperation, but you don't really see how a machine could edit the film. And of course, editing is very essential in your process. You're very inspired by the legendary Walter Murch. And editing, of course, is the moment when the decisive step happens in the work, and you say a machine can't do that. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how this cooperation with AI could happen, how you could imagine the man-machine cooperation?
So last week, Hans and I were talking about this. We were thinking back to Walter Murch, and I was also thinking about this comic book artist named Scott McCloud, who writes reflexive comic books about writing comic books. And one of the things Scott McCloud describes is that comics obviously have no sound, they have no sense, they have no time the way that a film can speed or slow down or create many cuts or just a few cuts. There's just whatever, 9 squares on a page or something like this. So how do you express dimension? And Scott McCloud describes, for example, us being in this room right now. Maybe if he was doing something from my perspective, he would show a close-up of the glass, Hans's paper, a shot close-up of Hans's papers moving, maybe a wide of everyone in this room, a shot of a bird outside on the ledge of the roof of this building, and that would comprise maybe a dimensional description of this moment. It wouldn't just be a shot of me, a shot of us, the stage, and you guys. Showing something like a close-up of Hans's papers moving would be a way to show that's a sound that I'm experiencing. I hear that sound of the paper moving. So that you can describe sound and depth of space actually just very simply in image. And this is something that Walter Murch, the editor, also took to another degree when he worked with ideas that were foundational to music concrete, which is a kind of inversion of outside and inside. If we wanted to express that this moment was scary, something bad was about to happen, we might have the sound of a an ambulance that's far away, super loud if we were editing it into this space, or the sound of loud rain, even if it wasn't actually raining. These are all the kinds of things that you can do in editing that also happens in comic books, and I'm sure happens all the time as a writer, you're thinking in this way. So editing for me and for other editors is a way to infuse any moment with a dimension that a linear construction or a non-edit lacks, essentially. And should I say AI stuff or no?
Yeah, no, that's what I wanted to ask you just now.
Yeah. Okay. So so one of the things about AI is that, well, obviously it takes a subjective perspective to form, for example, as I was describing this, Scott McCloud way of dealing with my perspective of where I am right now. AI can't do that because an AI is a different brain. It's not my brain. But maybe what AI could do is pick up on sensitivities between spaces that I can't perceive myself. So maybe a kind of micro view that I don't have the ability to see. For example, maybe there are organisms in this air right now that are also inflecting on the dimension of my experience. I can't see those organisms. Maybe a form of AI could. Or maybe there's a way of creating frames between Hans and I and perspectives that aren't from my viewpoint, aren't from his, aren't from yours, but are from somewhere else. So I think that this is a role that AI can play in editing and in story construction, but it doesn't have really anything to do with this dimension from subjective experience.
Thank you, Rachel. Uzo, is there anything you would like to say or ask in relation to what Ian and Rachel said, to bring it back to you?
Well, no, I mean, I actually just wanted to comment on the installation film yesterday, and just if we're talking about togetherness, I was thinking about the idea of watching it in a movie theater, and the fact that the hill or the mountain or the mound, the void, forces an awkwardness of sort of like relationship that you wouldn't have if you're in your individual seats with your armrests. I mean, I remember trying to scramble up and one, stay on it. Yeah. I kept sliding down. I don't know if anyone else had that experience. But two, just being very aware of the bodies around me and how I was positioned in relation to them. And also just to say congratulations. I thought it was a brilliant work. But I wondered if you could say something about that intention.
Oh, I didn't actually know when I designed the hill that it would do that, so I didn't have an intention about people falling off or scrambling to stay on. So I don't know if I can say anything about that. But yeah, absolutely, this thing that you can do in an art context, which is that you actually don't have to sit in a chair like this, and that your distance from the screen is actually something that you can decide yourself. In a movie theater, you sit like this, you look at the screen like this, and that's all that it is. Here you can roll, lie, stand, be with someone, not be with someone, and I think that's something that sculpture can offer.
And it's interesting also because, of course, with VR, we went away from this idea again of actually seeing something with someone else or for someone else or through someone else, this togetherness we all experience on the hill or the mountain, as I call it. And with VR, we're isolated with the goggles, and I think what is so interesting now with mixed reality, where there are moments of virtual reality and moments of non-virtual reality mixed, is that, we can actually have that all together. It's again an experience of togetherness. I had one last question I wanted to ask you all, and it really has to do with what Maria Finders, wrote about when she mentioned the idea of declarations. Maria sent me an email the other day, are there still declarations? And I thought that was interesting in relation to what I told you about Senate earlier today. And of course, trying to set an international agenda provoked the creation of the UN, and indeed, the first Declaration of Interdependence, which is the 1944 Declaration, I quoted in the introduction by Will Durant. And then there is a second declaration I think we should mention here, which is the whole Earth Catalog from 1969. I went to interview Stuart Brand a couple of months ago, and Stuart Brand, talked about the interdependence there of species and the planet. And that, of course, was prompted by this moment when all of a sudden, we could go to space and we would see planet Earth from outer space, and And that created a very altered, I would say, augmented feeling of this interdependence, and how it all connects. And the whole Earth Catalog remains a very important declaration in that sense. So I wanted to ask the three of you if you still think that such a declaration of interdependence would be possible today, or if the age of such declarations is over.
Well, I was just thinking about this whole Earth image, and the other day, Ben Vickers and I were talking about how it is when a person, some people have their obituary already written, and they're only like maybe halfway through their life, because you never know. And it is often those who have already written their obituary just to prepare, but they still have maybe 40, 50, 60 years left of life, that they're most likely to actually radically change something about their life, because you read your obituary and you're like, that's me, like I can sum myself up in 2 paragraphs, that's like, and that reminds me of this whole Earth image, which creates a great deal of empathy when you can put on a plate all of humanity, or all the spirit of humanity. And when you can do that even for yourself and see your obituary outside of you and in front of you, it's like, you want to aspire to more spirit of humanity than what your pathetic self already is, so then you try to do it. And I think, I don't know, maybe if we all took an exercise to write our pathetic obituary, like this would be a way to actually be more connected.
Amazing. And also?
I mean, I think a lot about these declarations, both within sort of the political context and then of their creation, right? And the idea that the UN was created at a time when a lot of people in the world weren't actually truly able to participate in that process. And I think what that has generated, and in general, like the systems that we deal with now are fundamentally flawed in that they are based off of what we consider a universal ideology that really is a cultural thing, sort of that is based off of this idea. I mean, I think you show this really well in your film of atomization, right? Of creating discrete, identifiable bodies that then have to somehow relate to each other in space or in other contexts. And that creates a particular system that I think works very well for some under the guise of accumulation and doesn't work very well for others. And the time that we're in, I think, is a time of reckoning for those systems, and also a time of questioning of the idea and understanding of the universality of what are considered Western values. And now, I say that without necessarily knowing what system comes next, because I was raised with those values, as we all were, and I think it's very difficult to see, as you were talking about, Ian, outside of that set of values if you're so steeped and your life depends entirely on them. I think what we have in this coming age, and getting there, I think, is going to be very tough for all of us, though some will weather the storm better than others, is the chance to construct systems that are actually based less off of the idea of atomization and more off the idea of fluidity. And just to give a quick example, I think when we speak about, again, within this debate of nationalities or cultures, this essentializing idea of like, I am French, or I am German, or I am Nigerian, those things actually have no meaning, right? And what the idea of fluidity, and I think we can see this in all of us on the stage. I'm Nigerian, I'm also American. What is how do you contain 2 atomized things in one body and not have mixed? There is no essential, and I think the political systems that we build and the declarations that are made are going to be ones that are based more off of this idea of fluidity. It's just getting there that's going to be very traumatic for all of us.
Rachel?
I don't have anything better to say than that. That's a great way to end this.
So I'm incredibly grateful to Rachel, to Ian, to Uzo. A big round of applause, and thank you all. Thank you very much.